Welcome to Design for Learning, a podcast from Notre Dame Learning. I'm your host, Jim Lang. The traditional teaching and learning model in higher education consists of students being exposed to new ideas, knowledge, or skills in the classroom, maybe practicing them a bit with some active learning techniques, and then leaving the classroom and doing the heavy lifting of the course on their own, writing essays, studying for exams, gathering in groups for presentations or projects. But with the advent of AI, many of us are questioning the wisdom of that model, as students are tempted to let AI do the heavy lifting of learning. So what should teachers and students be doing, both inside and outside of the classroom, in the age of AI? What is our time with students in the classroom for when students can use AI to do their homework, write their essays, and create presentation slides? If those products that have traditionally demonstrated student learning are now less reliable indicators of it, how will we know when students have learned? Today's guest has been a vocal proponent of a philosophy that's always existed on the higher edges of higher education, but has taken new prominence in this current moment. If we care about it, students should be doing it in class. Lily Abadal is an assistant professor of instruction at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. Her research focuses on virtue ethics and moral formation, particularly in relation to emerging technologies. She has presented original research at the American Academy of Religion's annual conference, Notre Dame's Center for Ethics and Culture, and numerous other academic conferences. She is interested in helping mission-centered schools design pedagogical strategies, develop integrity-centered policies, reimagine assessments that align with their values, and encourage genuine character formation in the age of AI. Welcome to Design for Learning, Lily.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Okay, so I first got to know your work through your LinkedIn posts, where you're starting great conversations about what higher education needs in this moment. And one of your recent posts sort of encapsulated one of the key suggestions you are making in your public work. But I want to just read a snippet of that, and then we're going to talk about it, like all the parts of it. And that essentially what this podcast will consist of is like a close reading of this quote.
Mhm.
Okay, so bring writing into the classroom. Make it slow. Make it effortful. Make it low stakes and careful. It works. It's not flashy or sexy, but it works. Okay, so let's start with this very first sentence here. Bring writing into the classroom. So why is that important? Why are you making this argument to faculty right now?
Yeah. So, why bring writing into the classroom? I think like most people at our current moment have realized that a lot of writing that's done outside of the classroom doesn't have the same integrity, or at least we know now it doesn't have the same integrity that it used to before. I would make the argument too that perhaps doing writing outside the classroom never had the integrity that we thought it did. But that'll take me on a sidebar that we might not want to go down today. But essentially, I feel like the method a lot of people have been using to encourage perhaps like good use of artificial intelligence, et cetera, outside of the classroom has just been, well, let's teach students, AI literacy. Let's tell them, what the boundaries are, and let's just pray and hope that they'll follow all of those things that we've outlined for them so neatly when they're home and they have, the unbounded access to these tools. Now, I don't think that's a wise way to approach things. And the reason I don't think it's a wise way to approach things is because I'm looking at this through the lens of a virtue ethicist. And I feel like a lot of students have what we would call vices or bad habits, proclivities that they have, kind of ways of interacting with these things, probably habituated by other aspects of our wider culture that make it really, really difficult to resist temptations to take shortcuts that would bypass a lot of the learning that we're hoping they would do by performing some of these assessments, et cetera, outside of the classroom. So kind of with that at the forefront of my mind, I don't think that it's wise. I feel like bringing something into the classroom where we can force students to practice things within proper boundaries and getting them to habituate using their brains in the way that we want them to use them, so that they're able to actually learn. I think that's a much more prudent way to approach assessment, especially maintaining the authenticity and integrity of assessments.
So like you're sort of habituating to and not just the students. We're all habituated to like using technologies to make our lives easier and get things done more quickly and efficiently.
Right.
But you're saying that students are, there's even especially accustomed to this now, given the way they've been raised with technologies, and you're trying to give them a different kind of experience, right? And you're not be subject to those temptations when they're doing their writing.
Correct. Yeah, 100%. And yes, I will agree. Everybody has those temptations. Everybody struggles with those things. The only way that we can habituate ourselves out of those temptations is by practicing the opposite of the vice, which is the virtue. And then eventually we might be able to get to a place, or we can get students to a place where they can interact with the technology well, but they have to have the virtue first to be able to do so. They have to have the strength of will to resist the temptation. It doesn't happen through just telling people what they should do. It comes through practice. Comes through practice, and that's the important part, I guess, of what I'm trying to say is we could tell students all day long. We could give so many wonderful speeches about the reasons why they should interact with artificial intelligence in very particular ways when they go home to do these things. But unless we kind of force certain practices that allow them to cultivate virtues to interact with those things rightly, our words are kind of like sails in the wind. They're just flapping around. They're not really actually accomplishing anything. So
Yes, and we're both parents, so we sort of know that you can tell kids to do things, and not necessarily, and it doesn't always work that way.
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's your first part of that quote is that sort of just bring the writing into the classroom because we want to habituate them to doing this work in the way that we think is most important. The next part of that quote is make it slow, and I know you've spoken about this as well. So what do you mean by make it slow?
Yeah, so I'll speak kind of from my own position in the humanities. So, the humanities, particularly classes in philosophy, we're focused on big questions. Big questions are ones that are very difficult to answer. Um, it is easy and kind of again tempting for students to want to, you give them a problem like what is the meaning of life, or um, what is the nature of reality, what is truth. I mean, these are really big meta questions that take a really really long time to think through well. um, what often was happening, I feel like, when we were assessing students outside of the classroom, and I'll just say this from my own experience, I was not the best student in undergrad, and I was a little bit full of myself. So I would wait until the last, hour and a half right before an assignment was due. I really wasn't thinking too deeply and taking a long time to really give the kinds of questions I was writing on the proper time that they deserved. Um, it requires slow thinking to come up with really good answers to these questions. A lot of this too, my you know, contrast from thinking fast and then thinking slow, was inspired by Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he really makes the argument that, rational thought is by necessity slow. It has to be. When we come up with quick judgments, those are things that, are more intuitive than they are rational. So I'm trying to force a slow process so that students are actually thinking through and reasoning through things, giving those big questions that I'm trying to get them to think about in philosophy anyway, the time that they deserve, so that they can be thought about well. So by making it slow and specifically structuring assignments so that they have to be thought about slowly. So, not you can again tell students take time to think about this when you're at home before you write your I mean, it's just not going to be something that happens. There are other competing demands. There are other priorities that they have that, and maybe even um, other commitments that they have to family, otherwise jobs, all these kinds of things, like playing sports, all these things. Then sometimes, inevitably, they start rushing. So my philosophy here is if you create a structure in the classroom that forces them to slow down, they can practice the art of what it means to slow down. They can kind of taste the fruits of actually thinking through something instead of rushing and doing it at the last minute. And then hopefully by tasting the fruits of, that effortful, slow work, they can come to appreciate it and will be that much closer to actually building the stamina and the virtue to practice that outside of the scope of the class.
So maybe this is the time to kind of say like what your process is, because you've written this book called Drafted, in which it's almost like a workbook for teachers to bring into the
Mhm.
classroom. And I see these two things coming together now. So you're going to bring the class process into the classroom, and you're slowing the process down by having it spread over many class periods. For example, like writing an essay. So explain that
Mhm.
process for us.
Right. Yeah. So I break it into, or let me kind of back up for a second. I One of the things I was trying to figure out with all this AI stuff was, okay, I want to preserve the term paper. I think this is super important. I want students to be able to sustain um, a difficult argument over numerous pages. I don't want them to just write like a quick 5 paragraph essay that they learned to do in middle school. I want them to be able to synthesize information from multiple different sources. I want them to be able to engage with secondary literature on these topics. I want them to, really give this like effort. I want to see that they can do philosophy. And to do philosophy, you have to integrate reason, the philosophical tradition. All of those things have to be synthesized into, the paper. So, and the paper I think is the best way to test this. And I'm very adamant about that. There are other means of, we can do oral assessments, we can have, them engage in Socratic dialogue, but nothing I think captures that sustained, philosophical reasoning quite like the essay, which is why I wanted to keep it. So I was thinking, how can I break up this process into smaller bits and then bring those smaller bits into the classroom so it was manageable and feasible for them to write during class time without like completely eviscerating, lecture and in class discussion. So what I did was I break it up into a few different parts. I start, which is a little bit uncharacteristic. I start with having them do research. The reason I say it's uncharacteristic is sometimes a lot of the way that philosophy classes work is they'll have students like pick a position or a thesis and begin there. I have them start with the research specifically. The reason I have them start with research is because oftentimes students come in, especially when I'm teaching things like ethics, they already have very like strong views and then they just go straight for defending the view that they already think. And then they're like, this is what I'm already committed to. Then they only look for research and information that supports that view. So I'm trying to get them to be more open to viewing multiple different sides of the issue before committing to something. So the way that this looks in practice is I have them find some secondary resources, kind of get a feel for what the conversation looks like in scholarly discourse. I have them print those out. So they'll print out two. They find two articles. They print those. I'll bring them into class. I have them annotate them and mark them up before they bring them into class. So they have to read them, take their own notes, all of those kinds of things. Um, and then in the workbook, I have some instructions and some things for them to be thinking about ahead of time and all of that good stuff. And then in class, what they'll do is they'll write, a traditional annotation. So they'll write 2 paragraphs about like a brief summary of what the article is about and why they think this might be helpful or relevant to the prompt that they chose to write on, or the eventual paper that they will write. Um, so that's the first part. Second part is I have them write what I call a problem statement. And this is where I want them to think through kind of what I call the contours of the philosophical problem. So I'll have them write, what are some of the questions that need to be answered in order for me to make a good discernment about or a good judgment about this particular issue. So if we're doing applied ethics and, they're talking about something like euthanasia or whatever, you know, what is a human being? What does it mean for a human being to die? I mean, all of these kinds of things are really important questions that they have to answer in order to really come up with a good uh, argument eventually about when it's acceptable to assist people in their death or not, right? So they'll come up with some essential questions. They'll come up with various different ways that you could potentially answer this question, looking at different sides of the issue and kind of what's at stake and answering it various different ways. This is all what I call problem statement. Again, trying to get them to really understand the depth and nuance of the problem that I'm getting them to solve. So that's the second part.
And is that on a different class? Is that a second class?
Yes, good question. And yes, second class. All of these are broken up into about 30, 45-minute segments. So, first part, I actually break up, they'll do one article in one class. Then following week, they'll do the second article in the other class. I give them each about 30 minutes. Same with the problem statement. It'll be the week after. So this is over the span of 3 weeks now.
And so how many weeks is this whole process going to take?
It takes an entire semester.
The entire
Um,
semester. Wow. Yeah.
yep. So it takes them the whole semester to do. Sometimes there's like a week here or there where I'll skip if I feel like one part needs a little bit more time, or we have midterm or something like that. Like I will skip it. So that week, that way there's that time is allotted for.
So I can see that this is obviously the process being slow down so much is extending through an entire semester essentially to write like one long paper.
Yep.
Now I can see two objections to that. So let's just deal with those quickly. One is,
Sure.
obviously someone might say, well, but I want class time to be used for giving them, lecturing them ideas and doing the readings and like, so what's your
Mhm.
response to that kind of objection?
Sure. So I have tons of time to do that still, is what I would say to that. So I still spend the rest of, let's say I have roughly 3 hours with them each week. And only 30 minutes of that is used for these exercises. So
Right.
it's not that much time in comparison. I have plenty of time to get through the content that I want to get through. The second thing I will say is I used to have this mentality, especially when I was like towards the end of graduate school, first couple of years teaching, where if I taught the history of philosophy, I felt like I had to get everyone in there. I needed to have like every major figure. I wanted to make sure like we didn't skip over Kant, like we couldn't skip over. Hey, we had to go through like all the people, the major players. They needed to know like every single one of them. Um, my approach now, especially with AI, is like relax. Like they're not gonna learn. Even if it's like a survey course, like realistically surveying the entire history of philosophy is just not possible in a semester unless you don't do justice to the thinkers. And as a result of that, what are you teaching students then? Like, oh, we can master Hegel in an hour and a half. Like, which no, you absolutely cannot. So I really try to like consolidate, or I have been trying to consolidate um, the amount of content that I'm covering to model to students too that these things are difficult to understand. Like we can scratch the surface of some of the major thinkers, but um, it's not nearly enough. So anyway,
Yeah. So
you
and
might think you need to cover all these things, but
yeah.
you don't. There's another.
Let me ask you another logistical question, which is like, okay, the students are doing this work in the classroom. What are you doing? Like these 30, 45 minutes? Like, are you just up at your desk, or are you walking around, you talking to them? What are you doing while they're doing this work in class?
That is a great question. So the way that I do this is I use this time to like walk around the class, and if they have questions or concerns, they can raise their hand. I'll help them walk through things. Um, Inevitably, in every single class period, I'm constantly talking to a student about their paper. So this is great for a variety of reasons in my view. Number one, it cuts down on office hours. So like just practically and logistically speaking, I can deal with a lot of the issues that students are having with their papers like in class. Um, Second, as they're struggling with things, they're able to have access to me where I can actually help them through those like in real time. It's not going to be just through like a back and forth email exchange, but they're sitting down and they're coming to some really important realizations. So just the first part. So let's say that they printed out some articles, they're annotating them in class. They're actually thinking critically like, oh, I thought this was going to work, but now that I'm really reading this a little bit more closely, I'm realizing maybe this doesn't make any sense to incorporate my paper. So then I'll ask them some questions. Why do you think that? Like what? And sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're like thinking in their head, like this had to be the exact argument that they want to make, which then I remind them, you haven't committed to a thesis yet, though, remember? So like that shouldn't be a problem for you. Second, there are a lot of different ways that you can incorporate secondary sources. It doesn't have to be just in the name of arguing for exactly what you want to say. You could use some papers as a foil to your argument. You could bring those things up in the section where you have counter objections. You could perhaps they just give a really good description of what Plato is talking about in, book 8 of the Republic, and you want to include that in your paper and cite them on that, really astute way that they've worded that. Um, all of those ways are acceptable uses, and so it allows me to kind of walk through and uh, kind of help them figure out, you know, some of the roadblocks that they have, and then ultimately surmount those roadblocks in real time. So it's been great for that reason. So that's what I'm doing. I'm walking around, um, answering questions, helping students like think through some things, um, and helping them knock down the roadblocks.
So do you think there's a significant, like the other objection I could see here is that a faculty member might say, well, you're actually reducing the amount of work they have to do outside of class. Like it's like less homework than it used to be, for example, or less studying outside of
Mhm.
class. Now I can
Yep.
see the process you're doing here is clearly very a difficult one for students to walk through. And so it doesn't seem like a real serious objection, but what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say I'm completely fine with them spending less time outside of the classroom.
I think the other thing I can see in the process you're describing here is that, I mean, students are going to be doing things that maybe they've skipped if they did at home. And like, for example,
Mhm.
like having like writing, annotating an article, like, yeah, they might just highlight that or just like find the quote they wanted, but you're actually making them like actually read the article and then like do a little summary of it, which, that's a skip most students will skip if they just
Mhm.
have to write the essay on their own. And so I can see that, as you walk them through these steps, it's a really you're producing this kind of like deeper thought, and there's this more extended process.
Right. No, 100%. I know for a fact they skip those things, and the reason that I know that is because they're telling me that they would skip those things like when they're in the process of doing, all of this, which I can speak to a little bit more after because I did say it works at the
Yeah,
end, and I know that that's something at the towards the end of the podcast you wanted to get to. So I'll save it for then. But um, they're telling me that they would skip all of those things. And I know that I skipped all of them, or a lot of them anyway, as an
right.
undergraduate myself. So I'm speaking from my own history of vice and experience.
Yeah, and okay, so we got away from the code here for a minute. So I want to go back to effortful. So it
Mhm.
says make it effortful. So tell me what you mean by effortful and why that's important.
Yeah. So I am a firm believer that anything that is new that is worth doing is going to be hard. Again, this is also like coming through, the lens of virtue ethics. Um, when you start your striving in the beginning, it is not going to be enjoyable. It takes a lot of effort. So when I'm saying the word effortful, I'm thinking of, so I play the guitar. When I first started playing the guitar, the process of like getting your hands to properly fit around the neck of the guitar and actually press down on the strings and play a chord so that it sounds clean, that is effortful. Okay, it is difficult to do, and it takes a while to really get comfortable enough to where you can play one chord well, but not only that, but actually play a chord progression that sounds nice. um, in the beginning, it takes months. It might even take a year until you're at a process where that sounds good. So it does require effort, and this, the effortful part of teaching is the one that I feel like a lot of times people skip over because that's not the one that students will walk away from and be like, "Ooh, that was such a fun class." Like, it sure you can make it fun, but as we get better at things, they become more enjoyable. That's the way it works. You're going to enjoy playing the guitar when you're really good at it. You're going to enjoy writing when you've become more fluent in the process of doing that, and when you can really see that your ideas are making an impact, and people are engaging with them, and like this is the fruits of excellence. Um, and so it's a process, and the beginning of the process is not that fun, but it requires effort. It's that slow, painful, annoying process of placing your hands in exactly the right way that they need to be placed. That is completely foreign to you, um, but you have to create that muscle memory over time, and the skill in order to be able to do it. And that's That's
Yeah,
what I mean by
and this
effortful.
again is kind of coming back to the idea that it has to be done in class because
Hmm.
if you're not sort of put in a situation in which you're doing this thing which is more difficult, you might skip that part when you're outside of class because it's not enjoyable.
Yep.
And so I think actually this is a kind of promise that we hear a lot of times about. Like for example, like you know, like an offense, like a telephone pole. There's little flyers.
Hmm.
Learn to play guitar. It's gonna be great fun, And
Yeah.
then so we hear this all the time. Learn something new. Learn a new language, and of course, it can be fun. It can become fun, but initially it's just challenging.
Hmm.
But I think, but your point here is that because that part is, um, like not always initially um, give you like positive results,
Right.
we need to help. We need to be there for students to say, keep pushing, right? This will get you somewhere,
Yes.
but you have to sit here with me, and I'll help you through this process. Then you'll be able to get to the part where you can enjoy it more. Yeah,
100%. And this is, if you think about it, Jim, this is exactly the way that we approach learning an instrument and sport. We do practice with someone there that's making us do it, right? Um, we don't say like, okay, we're just going to tell you what you need to go do at home, and you just do it at home, and then we'll come back and hopefully you guys know how to swing the bat now. No, the coach is there physically guiding you and trying to show you exactly how to do that in real time, and you're going through the motions like over and over again. Like that's what practice is for. It's not for just discussion.
yeah.
You actually have to practice it with the coach present that can, as you said, help you get through those hard things, and um, really save you from yourself, from opting out when it's difficult.
Yeah, I totally identify with this because I have a tutor that helps me like work on ancient Greek, which I've been doing for a while now, and when I'm doing translating sentences on my own, I kind of get like I can see that what the sentence basically means. I kind of sort of roughly understand it, and then I keep moving
Hmm.
along. When I'm with him, he's like, no, what's that verb? Like, what's what mood is it? What tense is it? And then I have to stop and think, oh, geez, all right, I have to go back. I kind of know what it
Hmm.
means, but like if I have to break it
Right.
down, that's more difficult, and I have to really rack my brain. But of course, it makes the difference. And I probably
Right.
would skip that stuff if I was just doing it on my own. Um,
Yeah. 100%.
yeah. So the effort does definitely bring the fruits, but you have to be. And I think the students might need that your presence to really help them work through those difficult parts.
Hmm.
That's great. So the next parts of the quotes were low stakes and careful, and I just wanted to hone on one thing there, which is the low stakes. So are they being graded for each parts of this process?
Yes, so I've tried a few different things. I've also been, in my own like posting on LinkedIn process, I've been inspired by a lot of other people that I've seen, posting about, their approaches to grading, not grading, rubrics, no rubrics. So I've kind of changed this process like almost every semester now, just experimenting and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and maybe modifying things a little bit myself. So I started giving them, when I started the process, they were they were graded. They're still graded. They were graded, but I gave them very specific rubrics, and I spent some time in class like talking about like exactly what I wanted, how many points they got for each, thing, each, section of my concerns or learning objectives or outcomes and all that good stuff. Um, they kind of started, and what I didn't like is a lot of their questions in class would be like, is this going to get the full points?
Yeah, yeah,
Like, is this good? And it was kind of distracting from what I was trying to get them to do, which was really like engage in the writing process. So they were just really focused on like, okay, I checked this box, I checked that box, check that box. So I still grade them. I more or less grade them for completion now. I try to avoid giving them very specific rubrics. We'll talk about what does it look like to write a good thesis statement, and we talk about like this is what a good thesis statement looks like. They'll write it, they'll rewrite it. They, we'll do all of that process in class, but I'm not saying like you get this many points for having this thing present in the assignment. You get this many points for that. Um, I just give them a flat like amount of points for each part.
yeah,
Some of the bigger parts I do attribute a few more points to, but I try to like talk about the points as like not like try to really not discuss it
yeah.
in class as much, and just focus on what I do tell them though is like, it's okay. And this is what I really wanted to accomplish through this whole process. It's okay if you try this and it doesn't, like, if you write your argument map and I look at it or the TA looks at it and it doesn't work. That's okay. That's, you're gonna have to fix it, but it doesn't, that you're not gonna like fail the class. Yeah.
Right. You still get
So
your points for trying and doing the work, right?
right, right. Um, so I think that makes them feel a little bit more confident that, this is really for, this whole process is really for them learning and building the best paper that they can build. And at the end of it, they will have something that they're really proud of, that they've thought through, and put a lot of time and effort into. And it's the product of, that trial and error where they're working on these things in class, getting feedback, implementing the feedback, and continuing on to the next process.
So that brings us to the end of the quote, which is it works. So
Yeah.
I can see two possible reactions to this from students. This has been great, or this has been so terrible. So
Yeah.
so which one is it?
So I will say overwhelmingly, like the response is pretty good in the beginning, which is to be expected. And so I will say this, as a caveat to everything that I've just said, and it makes sense when you think about the fact that in the beginning the effort is not fun. Um, they moan and groan. I don't really think they don't really get it until they're a little bit through it. So until they've walked down the process a little bit, and then they kind of can see how, like, the method to the madness anyway. But yeah, in the beginning, they're like, why do I have to write it? Why can't we just do it on the laptop? Like, blah, blah, blah. And, I will give them answers to these things, but it's not until they're actually in it that they see why it's useful. I do a little survey at the end of my classes specifically on this process so that I can tweak it and maybe make some changes if need be. Um, and pretty consistently, the answers that I or the feedback that I get from students is, I've thought about this paper more than I've thought about any other paper that I've written. And to that, I'm like, that's exactly
Yeah, that's a good.
what I
Yeah,
wanted to happen. And a lot of them will say, this actually helped me really critically think through my argument in a way that I definitely would not have if I was just doing this at home or doing like the traditional way. I've also had a lot of students say things like, I've become really dependent on Chat GPT to do a lot of my work and thinking. And this process made me realize that, which is not good. Um, they're saying it's not good. This is their own kind of admission. I don't, ask them to give me, the details necessarily about exactly how they're engaging it with it outside of class, but that's something that has kind of voluntarily been brought forward by virtue of them going through the process. So um yeah, they overall feel like they have really engaged with the process of writing a paper more so than they have in other classes, and that they really own the argument at the end. Like they will become very attached to their argument, and like it being good. Um, they're really struggling and thinking through it. Now, had they done that at home, I don't know if they would have come to these
yeah,
same realizations. I think they might have just tried to, force something in. Um, Hope it works.
yeah, and finding out work arguments don't work is part of the learning process, right? And having to go
Mhm.
back and reshape things and revisit your own thinking. That's part where that's what we sort of want from this
Right.
education process. Okay, so actually, that quote took us all the way to the end here. We're at the closing of the episode,
Yeah.
and so, but readers might want to know, how do they walk through the same process that you have modeled for us? So, how would they find out how you do this in a more concrete way?
Sure. So I actually have something coming out with Inside a Higher Ed where I kind of map it out. I go through like each one of the parts. It's not like super detailed, but it'll it'll be out soon. I also have an article in Teaching Philosophy that unfortunately is behind a paywall for most. But if you shoot me an email, I'm happy to send you a copy. Um, and that basically just goes through like the whole pedagogy, the way I structure my classes so that I can make all of this work. Um, some of the other things that I do in class that makes this more fruitful in terms of peer review and all that good stuff. Um, so I have that there. I also am happy to share like reviewer copies or PDFs of that, drafted workbook, the whole thing that I've built out. It My process is built specifically for classes in the humanities, so it might not work for everybody, but definitely something that can be looked at and adapted. I feel like for multiple different classes, anything that's writing intensive, and that includes some kind of argumentative paper, and that can be found at my website. Um, there's a place to like actually buy a copy of it, but again, if you're faculty or teacher, I'm happy to share it with you, so that you can take a look at it and see how you might use something similar in your own courses. So my website's drlilyabadal.com.
All right, that sounds great. Thanks so much for this conversation. I'm really, obviously, I'm a big fan of committing to writing and writing in class. These things I think are really powerful teaching tools. So I'm glad to hear your arguments for them, and I hope other folks will be inspired to bring more writing into their classroom.
Me too.
All right, thanks for talking to
Slow
us today.
thinking's good thing. All right, bye, Jim. Thanks.
Yeah. Designed for Learning is a production of Notre Dame Learning at the University of Notre Dame. For more, visit our website at learning.nd.edu.